Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's doing good today. We are very pleased to have everyone here at our event on renegotiating NAFTA, energy opportunities and challenges. Always really pleased to see such a big audience towards the end of July. It means everyone's still engaged. And we're really pleased today to have such an expert panel on this topic. As many of you know, my name is Sarah Ladislaw. I direct the Energy and National Security Program here. We think and talk a great deal about North American energy from a variety of perspectives, whether it's the oil and gas landscape, which has been dramatically changing over the last decade or so, to the electric power landscape, to the drive for more renewable energy, a whole range of issues. And the importance of trade in that is it can't be overstated. And so we thought it would be a good time before we sort of seriously break for a summer holiday to talk a little bit about what opening up NAFTA and renegotiating NAFTA, as the administration has proposed to do, would mean or could mean for the energy sector, and how we sort of divide that into potential opportunities and potential challenges. I am up here for one reason today, and it is to introduce Dave Pumphrey, who is going to be leading off and moderating and running this session. For those of many of you know Dave, and for those of you who don't, Dave was with the CSIS Energy and National Security Program for quite a while, and before that was with the Department of Energy in the Office of American Affairs, and was involved, he did America and Europe and Asia in the Office of Policy and International Affairs. And Dave was one of my first bosses in Washington and taught me a huge amount about what I know on energy. And we are always really, really pleased we can get him off the beach and have him come back. And because Dave was actually involved in negotiating the energy chapter of NAFTA originally, this was one that he particularly wanted to come back for. So I'm going to get off the stage, but wanted to just give a really warm welcome to Dave, who will kick off the session and also introduce the other speakers. Our colleague Scott Miller here, who knows, I think, everything about trade agreements, and I mean like all of it, all the details. And then Andy Scheuer, who's agreed to join us from Sibley Austin, and who's been following really in depth what the energy portions of the renegotiation can look like. So without further ado, Dave, we're really, really pleased to have you back. So thanks for taking time to be with us today.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and I'll have the check to you shortly in terms of the introduction. It really is a pleasure to be back. It's been a couple of years since I participated in an event here at CSIS, and so I see a number of familiar faces, and I'm glad to see a lot of people that I haven't seen in previous sessions. So I think it really shows this program is doing great. And Sarah, you're doing a great job in adding Adam, and where's Frank? Frank come in? Frank's in the back, okay. So all my friends from the program, they'll say hi. Can I was going to do this after I talked, so if we can. So I spent years here in the energy program, which always had a sort of philosophy that you got to put everything into a PowerPoint slide. I've kind of gotten out of that, so we've done up some charts here of energy flows, which we will I'll run through after I do my introductory talks. But now that they're up, everyone can be watching them. So at any rate, well, first, clearly, as you're looking at the North American market, energy, trade, and investment are a critical part of that overall continental economy. There's the estimate I had gotten with some help from the staff here at the energy program is it's about $100 billion in energy trade in 2016. And that's $100 billion when the price of oil is half what it was a few years before. So it would have been significantly higher. Canada is not only the largest provider of oil and petroleum products to the United States, about nearly 4 million barrels a day, in 2016, but it's about 3 times the second place country. So having followed energy issues and energy import issues, to thought we would end up with Canada in this position within our trading environment and our import environment is something that I don't think anyone would have predicted a while ago. If we look south, Mexico was a major producer, exporter to the U.S., as you can see in that first slide, which was not necessarily supposed to be there, but it's helpful now. And really was in 1985 was almost twice what Canada was. But in recent years, you've seen a major decline in both production and then what's left over for export, as well as they've become a major importer of U.S. natural gas brought forward by the shale revolution, as well as U.S. petroleum products, a need that has been created by refineries that have not been renovated. So we've got a very active trading environment. So the one thing I was going to start with was talking a little bit about what are the energy provisions in NAFTA currently? So why did we get the pieces that we've got, and what are some of the implications of those? I participated actually in both the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement as well as NAFTA. And when we started the Canada agreement, we began saying, well, we're going to have a trade agreement that will cover all aspects of trade. So all of the normal tariff issues, dispute settlement, all those things will apply to the energy sector as well. So what is the special attribute that would cause you to have a special chapter on energy? And in looking at the time frame, mid-'80s, we'd just come out of very intensive government intervention in both countries. U.S. had oil price controls, had just not too long before that had oil import control program, natural gas price system. Canada had a national energy policy program that had really put some of those same things in place. One of my favorite memories, and Frank may remember some of this, was we were at a point where we were actually at a government level negotiating the border price for natural gas to be exported from Canada to the U.S. So you'd sit down, set this price in relationship, and then everybody would pay that price. So not a very market-oriented relationship. But both countries have started to move away from that by the time that we got to the mid-'80s and the beginning of the agreement negotiations. So we sat down and started to talk about what would be useful to provide in this agreement in the energy area. And it was really what can be done to set in place an environment where the government is much less present at the border in I guess, a view that perhaps somewhat naive would say, how do we make the border disappear for energy trade? And we're working in the context of a trade negotiation, not in a political. Not to say trade negotiations aren't political, as I'm sure we'll hear, but you're looking at a set of rules that are in place that you have as your starting point. So the decision was to work with the set of rules in the GATT, which is the basic fundamental starting point for the trade negotiations, and look at those areas that allow governments to sort of choose to interfere, that if they interfere with exports or interfere with imports, what's the basis if they get challenged in the GATT of, well, this is why I did it. And two areas came out in particular notice was provisions that allow exceptions to free trade for the purposes of conserving natural resources. So if you've got a natural, non-renewable resource that you want to preserve, sort of defines the traditional energy markets, you can restrict the supply, but you've got to make sure you treat all of your customers equally. But that's your foreign customers. On the other side is the article that allows you to take national security issues into account and then act to restrict trade. And from a Canadian perspective, they were very worried about the U.S. using that in the future if there were some kind of import restrictions. So those two provisions of the GATT became the focus, to sit down and can we write language that is tighter than what the GATT provided. And for the conservation of natural resources, we ended up with something which was called the proportionality clause, which is a great term of art. But it basically said that if you decide that you're going to restrict the production of a good, the one thing you've got to do is make certain that the burden is shared between domestic and foreign customers. So you can't just say, well, we're going to reduce the production of, take one example, natural gas, and say that, well, we're going to make sure our domestic market is served fully first, and then any excess goes to the one market we have, which is the U.S. So this caused a stir in Canada and some of the Canadian provinces, but it was still agreed to by the Canadian negotiators that we'll put that in place to do that. On the national security side, the question became, well, you've got a list of things you have to take into account when you look at invoking this exception. But to do that, there's some language that's fairly broad, and it really is a government's assessment of its national security. So the language in that was narrowed to being situations that were really closely connected to being a wartime situation rather than a broader national security concern or international crisis. I think it's the GATT language or something to that effect.
Emergency and international.
Yeah, and so that was seen as something that you can declare that you think you have now an emergency in international relations and you need to restrict the flows of in and out. So those two items became the core of the effort to back the governments away from having the tools to interfere in the marketplace. This is not to say that governments, if they think they need to, won't do it anyway, and then they'll have to fight it out, but it was an effort to put a framework there. There were a few other kind of nagging issues that got added to the chapter. One was on energy regulators and what energy regulators do, and a long debate about can we restrict energy regulators' ability to, in effect, affect contracts that were written. There was a historical concern that the Canadians had about some rulings that had taken place that had changed the contracts. That ended up with very soft language that basically was saying, it'd be really nice if regulators didn't just interfere with contracts and took that into account, because it turns out that Canadian regulators were no more happy to see themselves bound than U.S. regulators were. So we kind of went forward with that. Now, we moved then, a few years later, into meeting with Mexico and talking about how we put an energy chapter into NAFTA. Both the U.S. and Canada thought it was important to put that chapter in there to continue it forward, even though the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement would continue. But it was clear once we started the negotiations that Mexico didn't want to do this. Their perspective was this was a violation of their constitution. Their constitution wouldn't allow them to accept limitations on their ability to decide what they would do with decisions about energy trade. We went on this around and round for a number of months on the negotiations of this. It stayed bracketed the whole time, even though we accepted Mexico's ask that we have a first sentence that says all the parties agree to respect their constitution, which we thought was a little odd since none of us were able to actually do anything that would have violated the Constitution, I don't believe. And the Canadians were unsure about what their Constitution was, but that's another issue. But that was put in just so they can clearly state that we respected the constitutional rights. The other thing, though, that was very important in this is Mexico made clear in reservations they took that the energy sector would stay in control of the Mexican government. The Mexican government owned the resources. The Mexican government would set up the companies that would actually develop those resources. There would be no scope for investment by foreign or domestic parties in the development of oil and gas or power generation. But they did add in 3 clauses, which I think came out of both an internal discussion as well as the pressure to show some forward movement, that would be areas where private investment might be allowed. The concept of having service contracts for the development of petroleum resources was put on the table and mentioned in there that Mexico may use those. It wasn't a commitment to do it. There was a clear commitment to allowing investment in certain parts of the power generation sector, independent power producers, production for own use, cogeneration, et cetera, which was something that was new. And then finally, the ability for natural gas providers to start direct end-user negotiations for imports of natural gas. So these were things that had not been on the table before that were the beginnings of what I would say has become now the reform process that has culminated in really opening up the sector to private investment. So to finish off these charts now, that you've seen 1985 for quite a while, so put this up because this was the trade situation at the time that we began the negotiations with Canada. So you see the natural gas and oil coming from Canada, and they were seen as important sources and the likelihood of being able to be increased over time. Some electricity, though electricity is a very special entity that's harder. First iterations, as we didn't include it, we thought for completeness we should include it, but it's very site-specific in terms of where you get that trade. You move to, 1995, about the time of the NAFTA negotiations, you see the markets become a little more dynamic. You're seeing, though, as it was in 1985, it's still both sides exporting into the U.S. with a very little bit of natural gas that was just beginning to flow into Mexico, which was a point in the negotiations that was one that we had taken up quite some number of times. We go to 2005, and now we see the market has really expanded. So the Mexico and Canada have now kind of switched places as to who's the larger crude oil provider. Natural gas has grown tremendously in terms of exports from Canada to the U.S. Some gas has grown in the exports to Mexico, very little gas. At one point in time, Mexico was expected to be a major gas exporter to the U.S. It never materialized because of their own internal needs. We then go to 2016, and in trying to do this chart, I could barely get the green arrow into it because you've got crude oil coming from Canada has just really increased tremendously, which is largely a consequence of the development of the oil sands in Alberta. But you'll notice that natural gas has started to fall off because we're starting to export gas from the U.S. into and Canada. On the other border, gas has grown tremendously in the exports to Mexico as well as petroleum products exports, but there's about a million barrel a day drop in the amount of crude oil being exported over that time period from 2005 to 2016 from Mexico to the U.S., which is reflective of the cratering of their crude oil production. So what we've really moved from is a marketplace that was pretty simple to understand. Canada and Mexico developed their resources to export to the U.S. to one that's extremely dynamic. And really, as we look at where we go in the next round of considering negotiations, the question will become, has this changed the basic principles built into NAFTA, or are we on the right track because we've seen this market grow tremendously, and what we need to do now is just focus on doing no harm in any renegotiations. So with that, Scott, I'll let you pick up on what the process is going to be, and will we do any harm?
I'll try for answering the first question. The second is more epistemology than politics. But in any case, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming out. And I always find it a great pleasure to talk trade policy to non-trade people because you have to actually be clear and use English and things like that. So it's a great challenge, but I'm delighted to be here today. And so thanks to the Energy Program for giving me a slot. All right. First of all, the renegotiation of NAFTA is basically underway. It begins with a consultation process. It ends with a consultation process. We are in the beginning consultation process right now. It actually ends with a vote in the Congress. But the administration had this as a key priority from the very beginning. They campaigned on it. President Trump campaigned on it. The 90-day consultation period is ongoing now. It will end August 15th. So this is a period of time where the administration solicits input from the public and from the authorizing committees in the Congress, and assembles its key objectives, its negotiating objectives, and then once the 90-day period has concluded, they'll begin negotiations. the administration released a summary, about 16 pages of bullet points, of their negotiating objectives last Monday, the 17th. So it was July 17th. So we've had them in hand. I'll talk about them a little bit. As I said, the consultation period ends August 15th. Negotiations begin August 16th. I guess they're ambitious. So that's the plan. The first round of negotiations is scheduled to be held in Washington, D.C., August 16th through 20th. Also, this week, the Ambassador Lighthizer named Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for the Western Hemisphere, John Melly, as the chief U.S. negotiator. Assistant Secretary Melly is a career official. He's had nearly 30 years at USTR. He's a professional. He will have the same role in the NAFTA renegotiation as, if you recall, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Barbara Wiesel, who was also an assistant USTR, was the chief negotiator in that negotiation. So that's the tick-tock of where we are now. We're about to start negotiations, but the administration last week gave us a snapshot of where they're trying to go. They released a summary, and so there's always, with a summary, there's always stuff behind the curtain you can't quite see, but let me talk about what's in the summary for those of you who had the good sense not to read it. Basically, it can be seen as sort of three themes or three baskets. The first is what I characterize as Trumpian flourishes. So, for instance, the president always talks about bilateral trade deficits as if they mean something in the context of trade policy. But you'll notice, if you look at the objectives for negotiations on trading goods, there's a little chapeau that said the goal of the agreement is to reduce trade deficits and improve the U.S. trade balance with the NAFTA partner. So it's got this little, at least there's a flourish to that effect. There's the themes that the president campaigned on can be found in these objectives in places like government procurement. The government procurement chapter is very interesting because what the U.S. is proposing as an objective is U.S. firms ought to have superb access, complete access to Canada's and Mexico's government procurement, but here in the U.S., we're just fine with Buy America. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm taking liberties, but that's basically what it says. Now, that's an unusual objective to set in negotiations, which tend to be some give and take. We'll see how that goes. Likewise, in the rules of origin. Now, this is really into the weeds, so trade people love rules of origin because you can hide a lot of things there because nobody looks. I think there are 160 pages of NAFTA rules of origin that apply only to that agreement. But in the rules of origin, the administration states their objective as increasing NAFTA and U.S. content. Now, let me explain. A rule of origin basically stipulates how much content of a finished good from the preference area has to be in the good for it to qualify for the preference. So in automobiles, I believe it's 62% of the content of the vehicle has to be originating in NAFTA, so all the parts and assemblies and all that, so 62.5% NAFTA content. Now, in a regional rule like the NAFTA rule of origin, 100% Canadian content would meet that content, that rule requirement, as would 100% Mexican content. So what we have here in the administration's objective is to include NAFTA content and U.S. content. Once again, no mention of Canadian or Mexican content. That'll be fun. Finally, I would point to the trade remedies section, anti-dumping, countervailing duty. There's been a lot of action in this space in the administration already. It's somewhat behind the scenes. If you're not in one of the industries that's been targeted, you maybe have not noticed it, but there's a lot of activity with the Commerce Department self-initiating anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases. But trade remedies in the negotiating objectives for the NAFTA has some very explicit demands to be made. One of them is to remove a chapter that goes all the way back to the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement called Chapter 19, which set up binational panels to review the decisions of trade remedy actions in any of the three countries. It's a particular affront to people who practice at the trade bar, like Ambassador Lighthizer, but they want to remove that completely. That'll be fun. Likewise, they reintroduced safeguards, which were suspended in the original NAFTA. So, fairly aggressive goals, but very much what you'd expect from a Trump administration based on the campaign, based on the president's comments and rhetoric. That's basket one. Basket two are what I characterize as commercial irritants. There may be 10, there probably are over 100 when you really get down to it. And the question of scope will be something the administration faces early on. But think of these as areas where the original NAFTA left gaps or access for whatever interest has gotten worse in the 23 years since NAFTA was implemented. There are a lot of these. The softwood lumber dispute, which is basically a subsidies dispute with the government of Canada that affects trade in lumber and forest products, has been ongoing since 1982. There's no end in sight. So there are a number of these irritants that will persist. Many of them, frankly, are in agriculture, and so if you don't follow ag, you won't worry about them too much. But the original NAFTA agriculture chapter set a fairly low bar. Ultimately it was 3 bilaterals: Mexico, Canada, Canada, Mexico, or Canada, U.S., and U.S., Canada. So these 3 bilaterals basically protected everybody's sensitivities, which of course there are a lot of in agriculture. Now, the ag markets have integrated in the last 23 years, so there's maybe some room for movement, but many ag issues are fairly sensitive. Our sugar program is a sensitivity. Canada has these sort of Stalinist supply management programs in poultry and dairy and eggs that are very frustrating for U.S. exporters in those categories. So there's a lot of room in agriculture. There are also some frustrations that have been long-standing. Canadian intellectual property for American inventive industries has been a frustration, many on the Mexican side as well. So those textiles and apparel, naturally, will have some irritants they'd like to solve. So there's this large sort of set of issues that have either gotten worse or weren't fixed the first time that many industries are willing to work on. How many of those get included, we'll have to find out. Finally, there's a basket of what I call upgrades. And this is an important section. Upgrades are basically areas of commerce where conditions have changed dramatically since 1993, or 1990, which is about when the commercial reality on which NAFTA was based. So the obvious one is digital trade. There was no commercial use of the internet in 1990. So including obligations on digital trade would be a very important step of upgrading the NAFTA. Likewise, the Trans-Pacific Partnership had a section on state-owned enterprises, not covered in the NAFTA. So there's another one. Labor and environment chapters that are actually included in the agreement would be new. It's a new policy in the United States since the NAFTA, and the original NAFTA included labor and environment only as side agreements. Now, but telecommunications, another area which has changed really dramatically, and those changed circumstances probably warrant an upgrade. Customs, believe it or not, customs processes are far more automated now than they were in 1990. So those upgrades are an important part of the NAFTA and are fairly broadly supported. I would include energy in those sections for an upgrade. And building off Dave's comments, we have greatly changed circumstances in North American energy since roughly 1990. Now, at the time of the NAFTA, from Dave's presentation, you got pretty clearly that our politics, in fact, the politics of energy in 1990 were largely affected by the shocks of the 1970s. Everybody was still sort of, that was fairly close in the rearview mirror. Everybody remembered it. The politicians had lived through it. That was a key measure. So keep in mind, we had a ban on crude oil exports until it was put in place by Congress in 1973, repealed, I think, 2 years ago. So there's a hangover of the 70s in a lot of the policy decisions that goes on. But however, that was not just the United States. Mexico's constitution forbade energy investment, hydrocarbon investment by foreigners, and as Dave mentioned, was excluded from the NAFTA. So today, if you look at not just this map, but you have the revolution in unconventional oil and gas in the United States. What we produce, what we have interest in exporting is very different, goes well beyond refined products. So there's that. Mexico made its constitutional reforms in 2013 to actually change their constitution and then put in place statutes which are permissive of foreign participation in the hydrocarbon sector for the first time. Now, I say permissive because that's an important potential negotiating goal if we wanted to pursue it. So what I think U.S. investors and U.S. operators would like is free trade and investment in energy in the NAFTA as a goal, and that in that case, what you would want the Mexico request would be treat investment in the energy sector according to the principles of national treatment and most favored nation and least trade restrictive policies. In other words, make it obligatory that the sector is open rather than simply permissive. Finally, a difference that will need to be sorted out, we haven't talked about, is renewable energy. It's a changed circumstance because all three governments have wind and solar programs, okay? And it will surprise none of you in this room as Washington professionals that all three programs have different standards for what qualifies for renewables. All three have different subsidies programs. They have different content requirements in the program. So while each of the three economies is pursuing renewables, they're pursuing them differently. And so the question is there a way to work together in the NAFTA on renewables? Unknown, but it is a changed circumstance. So overall, that's what I characterize the energy sector not only as a possibility for upgrades, but I think there's a way to improve things substantially for actors in the sector and for consumers. So I'm somewhat optimistic about that. Before I close, let me turn and retrieve my dog-eared copy of The Art of the Deal by Donald J. Trump, bestseller in 1987, and talk about the downside risks. Because, in fact, in that book, rule number one is think big, so stay with that. But rule number 2 is manage the downside risk, and the upside will take care of itself, which is actually fairly good advice. And you often have to think of the downside risk in trade agreements. So what are the downside risks? Well, there's a downside risk of outright collapse, but that's a tail effect I won't talk about. 2 I would point to as potential downside risks that could make things worse almost by accident. The first is investment. There is an investment chapter in NAFTA. It's called Chapter 11. It's become quite famous or infamous, depending on your point of view. And NAFTA Chapter 11 and the investor-state dispute settlement has, over the years, become the bête noire of many NGOs and has plenty of critics. I would also note that at the moment, it really doesn't apply much to investments in the Mexican energy sector because in NAFTA they were closed, so it wasn't a covered service at the time. But I also point out that Canada leads among OECD countries in investment disputes in which they are a respondent. In other words, Canada has had more cases filed for them to respond to than any other member of the OECD, which includes Mexico. All right, so you got an interesting situation here. The U.S. administration, the Trump administration, has made no statements at all about their policy with regard to investment, other than sort of reiterating what was in the Trade Act of 2015 in the NAFTA objectives. It would be an odd failure if somehow NAFTA Chapter 11 got thrown overboard just as U.S. investors were able to get full protection and security in the Mexican energy sector. So that would be a bad outcome, and we ought to think through it. And there's a non-zero chance of that happening. So something always gets thrown to the sharks in these things. That could be it. Second, and this is one that troubles me through the objectives, is the emphasis on Buy America of this administration. I think that the reluctance to understand North America as an integrated economy and see Mexico and Canada as partners, and the continued emphasis on Buy America could easily make these negotiations a lot more difficult. Keep in mind, on January 24th, there was a presidential memorandum on pipelines. And the pipeline memorandum was done basically coincident with the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. But what that pipeline memorandum does is insist that in order to permit a pipeline, you must use U.S. materials in the construction of the pipeline. Now, let's wind the clock back here. In the case of TransCanada, the operator of the Keystone XL pipeline, a Canadian firm, that kind of instruction would be a flat violation of GATT Article 3. It's a violation of national treatment obligations to that foreign entity. And it would be absurdly quickly dismissed in Geneva. However, think about it from U.S. operators and how this might cloud the negotiations, because what you have is the U.S. federal government telling private firms, this is not government procurement. Buy America has its own sort of set of rationales either strong or weak, depending on your point of view, in government procurement. And we live with them there, as do most other economies. This executive order, this memorandum, basically tells private firms who their suppliers could be, okay? I used to work for a private firm, and I think some government official who came in and told us who our suppliers would be would have quickly got it escorted out of the building by security. But nonetheless, that's the situation we're in. So I'm a little concerned of how expansive this gets, but once again, a downside risk to be managed throughout all this. So with that, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you very much to CSIS, to Dave, and to Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was asked to speak on 2 points as a sort of cleanup. What would a modernized NAFTA look like? And my answer will be, it's going to look a lot like the TPP. But, bold prediction, I think that there will be an energy chapter in it. That there is no energy chapter in the TPP, but I'll explain why I think that better than 50% odds, and given the sort of psychology of trade agreements, why we will see an energy chapter. Secondly, I was asked to speak about some of the sensitivities, essentially what do people want, and what is so interesting, as I was telling my colleagues before we came in, is that this is really the NAFTA modernization exercise is very much a microcosm of the debate about the future of energy. Because when you look at the expressed interests of various stakeholders, the folks who are tied to fossil fuel very much want the NAFTA modernization to push that forward. And those who see a future oriented to non-fossil fuels want to take it in that direction. So the delicious irony here, I think, is that what the Trump administration has done by creating this exercise is to freight an already difficult process. Any trade negotiation is very difficult, not only to conclude, but to get through Congress, but to freight that with this very simple question as to what is the future of energy. So I think it's going to be a very difficult process going forward because you add these two very difficult political questions. I'm going to then track some of these sensitivities in terms of what do people want, talk a little more about the standards issue, which Scott mentioned, the subsidies question and environmental protections and how that might work, and also the investment issue that Scott mentioned. Before I get to that, because I am a law firm lawyer, I wanted to at least express some disclaimers and disclosures so you would have the basis on which to judge my comments based on my evident biases. I'm not a dispassionate scholar like my colleagues. First of all, 26 years ago, I was appointed by my boss at the time at USTR as the deputy legal counsel for the NAFTA. So I worked as a legal advisor for the U.S. government, for USTR as a lawyer on the agreement. I didn't write the agreement. People like Dave wrote this agreement. But I did type a lot of it. And it was only because of bad planning. We had a couple of laptops, but everything was on floppy disks, and things took longer than they were supposed to take. So we were doing a lot of retyping after the secretaries had left, particularly when we were working in the Watergate Hotel, which was where we had a sort of focal point. So I don't know if you feel the same way. Like if you type a dissertation or an email, and maybe this will be the last generation that types anything with voice recognition software, but when you type it, you own it. And so this is the NAFTA. It's hard for me to be dispassionate about something that parts of which I typed. So I want you to know that I'm not going to be effectively critical of an agreement that I helped to type. Secondly, my law firm, Sidley Austin, represents many clients in the oil and gas sector, both those that produce and distribute that, so you should know that. I'm advising a client right now, and we're doing the legal work around NAFTA modernization. It is not in the energy sector, but I'm being paid to do that. But lastly, and I probably should look in the cameras on this, this is the hardest thing for a law firm lawyer to say, no one is paying me to be here. These are 90 painfully pro bono minutes for me. So I want you to know that that's hard for me to admit, but there's nobody who's paying me to say what I'm going to say right now. All right, so let me go back to the first point then. What will a modernized NAFTA look like? It shouldn't come as any surprise that since the United States, Mexico, and Canada have just concluded a trade negotiation, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, notwithstanding its fate here in the United States, that it was, in some sense, an opportunity to modernize the NAFTA. And so if you look at the TPP, this is 1/3 of it, I guess, because of as Scott was saying, there's hundreds of pages of rules of origin and then annexes. But if you look at these provisions, I think that will be instructive, in my view, as to what a modernized NAFTA will look like, because these three countries just got done doing this. Now, it was done with a different negotiating dynamic. So, for example, Japan, which has not been a free trade partner in the past, was at the table. And so there was leverage there that will not be available to the United States in this negotiation, and that might affect the outcome. But I think in terms of what you might see, the TPP is instructive. But I think that we'll also have an energy chapter. Dave has explained why we had an energy chapter coming from the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement into the NAFTA. This is the odd dynamic. So let me, again, as Scott says, it forces me, when I'm talking to non-trade people, it forces me to try to be clear. In the most straightforward free trade agreement should be about a page long, right? It should just say, hi, we're parties to this agreement, and we're not going to stop any trade. So the fact that it's so long tells you something, and a lot of it is in the exceptions, right? Those rules are, since they're so easy to say, a lot of the real meat is in the exceptions, what you're carving out and why. And that's what takes the words. In a modernized NAFTA, one approach would be to fully incorporate the energy sector into the GATT world, and in which case you wouldn't necessarily see energy as called out. Dave described that for some reasons, including the national security exception, we actually made it more restrictive. We made it harder for governments to invoke the national security exception. But one could argue that if you really just want to deal with energy, then you just bring it in and you don't need to say anything special. And here's the psychology part that I find in dealing with clients. The hard part with that is when the stakeholders come to you and ask you, where's my stuff? Where's my stuff dealt with in the agreement? There's nothing to show. Because, as a lawyer, I can say, you're covered. It's in there. It says, thou shalt not impose restrictions on trade in any goods. Okay, your goods. You can invest in anything you want. You can provide services. That's not fulfilling for a stakeholder, right? It's hard for the government relations person in Washington to sort of sell that to a CEO. It's hard to sell that to a trade association. You want to see your stuff in there. So I think that there will be an energy chapter, in large part because the energy sector is so important for North America. And so I'm not sure that it will do much more than what one would see in the TPP. As I said, there is no energy chapter in the TPP, and I look back and I'm not aware that any of our free trade agreements actually have an energy chapter other than the CUSFTA and the NAFTA. But I think, if you're following me, there's a logic to why you might have a chapter in there. What would the chapter do? Scott mentioned the negotiating objectives, the summary that was published on July 17. I will read to you the energy objective. It's nice, there's only one bullet point, but it calls out, I think, two interesting concepts that are worth discussing. Okay, for energy, here's what the U.S. wants. Preserve and strengthen investment, market access, and state-owned enterprise disciplines, benefiting energy production and transmission, and support North American energy security and independence, while promoting continuing energy market opening reforms. I want to talk about energy security. It's something that I think in these halls has been discussed for a long time, and then North American energy independence, which is another concept. If you were really interested in energy security, that is, I guess, not relying on anybody else or holding on to your own resources, you wouldn't do a trade agreement. A trade agreement is not a good idea if you want to hold on to what you got. So trade agreements are, and this goes back to the GATT, are sort of antithetical to the notion of energy security. There's nothing in the GATT, there's nothing really in these free trade agreements that moves you along a path to protect energy security. It's not a concept that's sort of recognized. So for those stakeholders that are eager to preserve natural gas, crude oil, what else, for us, keep it for us, the world of trade agreements is not particularly helpful. But that problem is already there, right? It was already there from 1947. North American energy independence, though, is interesting. Because what a lot of stakeholders, if you look at the comments, talk about is that we are poised to really cut out anybody else. I have to tell you something that 26 years ago would have made me giggle, but the United States is the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. Coupled with the resources in Canada and Mexico that Dave talked about, people are kind of ready to say, you know what, we don't really need anybody else. That's something that you can do in a free trade area or a customs union, with some caveats, because you're not allowed, from the WTO standpoint, to impose new restrictions on other guys. You can reduce relatively the restrictions on yourselves, but you are not permitted legally to impose new absolute restrictions to others. So if you're creating enough preferences so that that would induce North American independence, that is doable. But you couldn't literally cut people out. You couldn't use the agreement to impose additional restrictions on others. So that's, I think, the sort of that one caveat there. Let me just say a word about these other sort of touch points. Subsidies. One of the most difficult issues that has come up in the WTO recently has been the tying of local content requirements to the support for clean energy and clean tech. So we saw a dispute involving Canada, the province of Ontario, which had tied its feed-in program for renewable electricity sources to local content. And that was found to be a violation of the GATT, and the province of Ontario ultimately eliminated that. We've seen similar types of programs challenged in the United States as well as in China, although it hasn't gone to litigation here in the United States in the WTO. But that will be an interesting issue. And you look at, there's a lot of commentary around the NAFTA about eliminating subsidies for fossil fuel, or the very fact that because of our tax system, is the United States vulnerable to challenge because of the advantages that we have for the production of crude oil or natural gas? And will that itself be subject to a challenge as a subsidy? Those are the kinds of things that you might see, I think, drawn out in the negotiations. Standards. As Scott had mentioned, the differences in standards makes it difficult to integrate. So those stakeholders who want to create greater interdependence and independence will try to push that. There's been a lot of learning in the WTO on standards. We've had there were sort of 3 disputes that dealt with the interpretation of that chapter. It's called the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, TBT. And so I would think, just as that we saw in the TPP, I think a lot of that learning might get incorporated into NAFTA because that will help. But that's a big focus commercially. That's a lot of money if you really want to support the interdependence. On the other hand, for those stakeholders, and they are many and vocal, who do not want to see fossil fuel being promoted, they may try to push hard against that kind of cooperation on standards. Finally, on environmental protections, which clearly have an impact on energy projects. In the NAFTA, the environmental and labor disciplines were in side agreements. They were done by President Bill Clinton after he took an office, and that was what helped in part to satisfy the political needs to get the NAFTA done. A lot of people would expect, just like in the TPP, that those environmental disciplines will get pulled in, there'll be a chapter, and that they want those to be subject to the same dispute settlement as everything else. So that's another thing that I think you'll see, and there's a lot of tension in the discussions that I've seen in the commentary. I'll stop there, and hopefully that we'll get a chance to talk about what you want to talk about in questions.
Great. Thanks, Andy. It was excellent. But you did answer a question I've long had, which was during the negotiations, what would happen with our documents? So now I found out you were typing them someplace as we sat around at another water-grade hotel room waiting for them. So we're going to do some sort of Q&A here. I will moderate the Q&A, and I said this is the best place for me because these guys are really the experts on getting down into the details, and I can dodge answering any of the questions that way. But I will not do that totally if you have some questions you want me to get to. I want to pick up on one thing, though, Andy, you were talking about at the end, that from an energy point of view is kind of interesting because standards are a big deal, especially in the energy efficiency side of the energy marketplace. And there's been a lot of work to try to do harmonization throughout North America on some of the standards and things. So it would seem that it might cut the other way. You were saying that you would fear that people not looking at a fossil fuel future would not want to see the standards sort of harmonization, but I think there would be grounds for saying that people looking at the alternative pathways, which is greater efficiency and perhaps renewables, would see that as a valuable tool for growing the marketplace. So,
and you're right, David. I think you could make that argument on either side. And indeed, if you look at the comments that were submitted to USTR for folks, they have made that point. Where you see it is more I think that the concern is for stakeholders who are environmental NGOs and the like. They're concerned about kind of smoothing the path.
Yeah, right. Or going to a lower common denominator.
Exactly.
Okay, I understand that. So why don't I throw it open unless you guys got questions for each other? Do you want to start there? Okay. So a few rules at CSIS, see if I remember them all, which is identify yourself and the organization you're representing, and we would like to have it in the form of a question, even if that's just a sort of raising your pitch at the end to turn it into a question. If you've got a statement to make, you can also say, well, don't you agree with my statement? That might be another way to go at it. But at any rate, we like to try to keep this at questions. Okay. Sarah, you want to get started?
Thanks, guys. That was really fantastic overview of both the sort of past, present, and potential future for energy within the NAFTA modernization. A couple questions. One, Scott, I'm just interested in, given everything that is in the potential areas for renegotiation and all of the Trumpian flourishes that you mentioned, what is the likelihood of actually closing this agreement again? And how do you know? Like, what are the potential scenarios we should think about? I mean, it seems really strange to be able to do it so quickly, but even if you can't do it quickly, can you actually get it closed again? Because I think a lot of the American public doesn't actually like NAFTA, or they don't think they do, or there's that political perception to actually close this agreement again is a big question in my mind. Andy, one of the things that you said I thought was really interesting. was this idea that people are poised for energy independence. And one of the things I think is really, Dave brought it up, is just, there were certain advantages for the U.S. in negotiating this agreement and advantages to Mexico and Canada and including energy in this agreement. That's all kind of changed now, and this idea that like energy independence is something that all three countries would want to actually execute on in this agreement. I take your point that you can't actually create additional barriers outside, but what the art of the possible be in sort of creating a more advantaged continental energy market relative to what we import from other places? I don't actually believe that would be a wise idea, but I'm interested in what that could be. And it brings up another issue, which is in the TTIP, there was talk of an energy chapter, and the Europeans were very interested in ways that the US and Europe could use energy in third countries that, by imposing our standards or ways of doing business and those sorts of things. That actually seems like it would fit with the current US narrative on energy dominance, which is a step beyond independence into using exports externally in external markets. Have you seen or heard any sort of conversation around those things? Thanks, guys.
Well, let me start, and I'll try to tell you how we got here. Any political consultant will tell you that it is a poll-tested winner to promise to renegotiate something. In fact, I talked to Bruce Stokes, who runs the polling operation for the Pew Charitable Trust, and they tested it. And it turns out that renegotiating the NAFTA is a 2-to-1 winner with voters. Senator Hillary Clinton and Senator Barack Obama both knew that or were aware of that in 2008 because they both promised to do it. During the primaries. Candidate Donald Trump knew it too, and he promised it. Now let's step away from the political consultants and look at the interests. And no one was asking for NAFTA to be renegotiated. No business, no farm group, nobody doing business in North America wanted a renegotiation. There were some people who were opposed to NAFTA 25 years ago, are still opposed, who want it to go away, but nobody wanted it renegotiated. So what you have is a political promise, a campaign promise, which has no constituency yet, right? And you could see that in the early comments every time the president would mention it. Believe it or not, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, and the Senate Finance Committee chairman would all say the same thing: do no harm. That was the position of people doing business in the NAFTA, was do no harm. So this becomes an important question because the administration has decided to do it anyway, and now their actions must focus on the ultimate of getting something done, which is finding 218 votes in the House and 51 in the Senate for a package of improvements and changes to the NAFTA in the form of an implementing bill. This is very, very difficult when you start without a constituency. That's where they are. So we'll see what happens. Now, in terms of the timetable, we know when we're going to start. There are two theories. You listen to Commerce Secretary Ross. He's got the theory of short negotiations. Most of the people around town have a theory of not short. I'm in the not short category, but that aside, frankly, the relationship between the U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada are very important. Mexico and Canada represent 30% of U.S. trade. Canada remains our largest trading partner. Mexico was number 3 the day before NAFTA. They're number 3 today. These are important relationships. They're very complicated. We created a commercial ecosystem with the NAFTA. It's intricate. It's easy to damage, and there is great fear on that. And the issues that remain for a renegotiated NAFTA are not easy. If you think softwood lumber is an easy issue to solve, don't tell it to the hundreds of attorneys on both sides of the border who have put their kids through college on that dispute, okay? It's resisted change. There's a lot of Canadian IP, not an easy issue. U.S. sugar liberalization, a really not easy issue, okay? Add to the fact that in the United States, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says Congress has the power to regulate foreign commerce. So the USTR has to negotiate with Canada, Mexico, and the Congress, okay? And in order to succeed ultimately. Now, why do I think not short? I think not short because of Mexican elections. All right, the government of Mexico who is cooperating in this renegotiation, will lose the ability to deliver on concessions about next February, maybe March 1st. I don't know. But there are elections in Mexico that happen in July, and with the longest interregnum in the world, the new Mexican president shows up in December. So unless you're concluded by February 2018, you start over in January 2019 with a new Mexican team, new government, no re-election potential there. So in other words, that's why it's not long, or that's why it's not short. Now, the end game is one that has to be developed very carefully. Andy mentioned this with the political difficulty of this, but you've ultimately got to find a way to bring the Congress along with you, which means bringing the American public along with you. So this could be long drawn out. There is a tail risk that our president gets frustrated with a long drawn out process and withdraws from NAFTA. I think that's a tail risk. It's a 5% or less. It would be catastrophic economically, but it is a tail risk. But beyond that, there's also a midpoint risk that they negotiate for 3 or 4 years and can't conclude anything that passes the Congress. That's what happened in TPP. Ultimately, that was a 5-year negotiation that didn't pass the Congress, and then the president acted after it didn't pass the Congress, or wasn't considered by the Congress. So these things happen in trade negotiations. So there is a midpoint scenario that you wind up with NAFTA at the end of all this. So stay tuned. It'll be fun. There'll be a lot to talk about, thankfully.
Sarah, to your question, there is, I think, in terms of the art of the possible, there certainly is a lot of potential here to create that kind of future, and indeed to use this as an opportunity to build in some of the intentions that were expressed between the U.S. and the EU. The difficult part, I think, is that it runs so counter to the main storyline with U.S.-Mexico trade, right? Again, coming out of the campaign, I think so much of the concern that was expressed by the Trump administration was that this is a terrible, the NAFTA is a terrible agreement because look at the numbers. We've lost so many jobs. We have lost so much opportunity to Mexico. So what this modernization needs to be is somehow to get that back, to rewrite the rules so that we are a beneficiary. In order to, I think, in order to promote interdependence, it seems like such a different storyline. Now, that's not impossible because I think they could look at the energy sector and say, okay, that's one where we're a winner because right now we have so much to sell. But I think that's going to be something that the administration is going to have a difficulty conforming.
Phyllis first, and then next question behind you.
Hi, Phyllis Yoshida. Stand up, okay. Phyllis Yoshida, Sasakawa, USA, formerly US DOE. To follow up a little bit on what Sarah said, certainly at DOE and in their agency, we had argued against energy chapters in the TTIP and in TPP. TTIP primarily because the Europeans wanted a preference and, can't give them a preference, we don't give Japan a preference, et cetera. But one of the other reasons was that there were moves to make, in the subsidies regime, the research subsidies that DOE gives to clean energy gettable. Have you seen any discussions of that at all in this?
Yeah, and let me just try to unpack that question for those who might not follow that completely. So originally, there were, originally meaning at about the same time that we did the NAFTA, we concluded the Uruguay round and created the WTO. In that subsidies agreement, there are 3 flavors of subsidies. So sort of green light, yellow light, red light. And the green light subsidies were R&D subsidies. They were not seen to distort trade because they were far enough away from commercial activity. That was okay. Go to the red light. The red light are prohibited subsidies. So those are subsidies that are contingent on export or subsidies that require the use of domestic rather than imported goods, those local content requirements. In the middle, the yellow lights are essentially everything else. Any other subsidy is actionable And if you can demonstrate that there's serious prejudice to somebody, then it's possible to challenge. But it's much more difficult. So those green light subsidies, they sunsetted after 5 years. So after 5 years, after the WTO came into force, there were no more of these green light categories, and everything dumped into yellow light. So that's, I think, the context for whether in a NAFTA context we would want to carve out certain types of subsidies and say, yeah, again, like, it's a good thing if everybody's doing R&D for clean energy, so let's make sure that that's not going to be subject to, as you say, gattable. That's not going to be challengeable. It'll be hard because this is just a free trade agreement. So you could, at most, you could say, hey, if you guys do that, like, we'll forbear, we won't challenge you. But you can't rewrite the WTO rules in the free trade agreement. So there's at least a limitation on how much you could accomplish.
Thank you. Tom Cunningham with Statoil. Great panel, really interesting and a little nerdy, but I guess we're pretty nerdy.
That's what
that's
the way we roll.
Preaching to the choir. Two-part question. One is, it's clear that there's benefits to all three parties to expanding energy trade, and that energy is a natural benefit across the continent. But what about issues that could undermine that are sort of ancillary to trade in energy, such as the trade in supply chain, like steel, other things that could be undermined? What's the potential for energy to be impacted by other parts of the trade agreement? And the second question, what's the potential for this agreement to chip away at protectionist issues like the Jones Act in the U.S. Gulf? Thank you.
I was actually going to add Jones Act to your list of thorny issues.
Yes.
So.
And of course, any law signed into effect by President Woodrow Wilson is completely above board and accurate and consistent with the times today. So yes, the Jones Act, but it's a persistent, very difficult issue to affect. In terms of I don't have an idea yet of how far they're going to go with energy, whether there will be a separate chapter on energy, which would include many of the disciplines we've talked about today. Another way you could get there without a chapter on energy, by the way, is just to include energy services as a covered services in the chapter on liberalized services. And therefore, anybody in the energy service business would have MFN and national treatment, would have full protection and security. It would be, so there are ways short of an energy chapter to liberalize energy trade and investment. But having said that, it's not clear to me, and Andy may have a better idea of what might interfere with that. In terms of the supply chain interaction, frankly, supply chains follow energy patterns now. Look at aluminum, okay? Aluminum is basically produced from bauxite where there's hydropower. Okay, so you have a sector which is a very complex supply chain, but entirely sort of driven by its energy footprint and the availability of low-cost energy. So that happens a lot in supply chains. Supply chains get driven by other reasons too. Like if you're in the auto industry, Interstate 75 drives a lot of supply chain decisions just because movement of goods still has to happen. So it's a fairly complicated issue. It's not clear to me how an energy chapter would affect that directly, but it's something we may find out. Andy may have an idea.
Well, just 2 points. I mean, one, again, as I went through the comments, I told my colleagues that I had a very sophisticated approach to preparing for this. I did a word search in regulations.gov for all of the comments, and I searched the word energy. So I thought that was yeah, it took me a long time to figure that one out. And there were like 187 comments. So there definitely are comments from stakeholders who are consumers of energy, associations that represent, who basically say, we should not be trading natural gas. Why would we give advantages to our trading partners? Because they're manufacturers. They're going to take this stuff and they're going to beat us at right. So you definitely see that, and I think there is a threat. The second is just to nerd out a little further. I assume that none of you were born knowing what the Jones Act is, so I'm going to tell you just what it is, because for trade people, it's something that people throw out and forget that not everybody knows it. So it's basic idea, and this is similar to other countries, but the Jones Act preserves for U.S. vessels coastal trade. So if you go from port to port, if this is sort of an internal trade, then that is reserved by law, by the Jones Act, for U.S. vessels. And so that's similar to, again, other countries have the same, but we had to preserve that in the WTO. And it is always something that is controversial on trade agreements because of the concerns of countries like Korea and others who build vessels and who flag vessels, like Panama, that want to get in on it. So that's the Jones Act issue.
Question, yeah, right.
Hi, thanks for the speech. It was great, or the talk. I'm Truman with FWH Associates. I'm curious to hear primarily, Mr. Miller, your thoughts about how the upcoming Mexican elections will impact the likelihood of changes to the rules on foreign investment in state-owned enterprises, or the chances of opening up the oil industry in Mexico to foreign investment. Thank you.
Okay, sure. You'd really need an expert in Mexican politics, which I am not. But what we do know is there will be a change in government in Mexico, and it will take place over basically the last half of 2018, and that will definitely affect the negotiations. Who's going to win in the policies they follow, I really can't say. The one element to watch is that the hydrocarbons laws passed after the constitutional reform in 2013 were permissive of foreign investment, but did not obligate the government to accept it. Okay, so that's the area where if I were a U.S. negotiator, I would be interested in a greater certainty of the Mexican energy services market remaining open to my service providers. But what the policies of who's going to even stand for election, who wins, and what their policies are, I'm the wrong guy. Thanks.
I thought I'd just jump in on that question as well. Had a lot of experience working with Mexican energy policy issues over the years, and one thing I noticed is that people, I don't think, understand the depth of the feelings about the government and state operation and ownership and operation of the energy sector, and the fact that making those constitutional changes was a huge deal. This is something that had been on the horizon for a long time. I advised, as being in government, having different bosses coming in who would say, make one of their objectives, well, we're going to convince the Mexicans to change their constitution. And, I would advise that I don't think you're probably going to get very far, and they would say, well, you're just a bureaucrat sitting there, I'll do it this time. And it never happened until finally it happened, which was always my sort of prediction, is that I will have a tremendous prediction rate, probably 99% accurate in saying they'll never do it, and one time I'll be wrong. And so, one time it happened. So that's a good thing, but I don't think that the feelings within the country will have yet changed deeply. So I think there is a risk that a populist president may touch on that, and the fact that it is permissive and not mandatory could be something that could be exposed. So I think that it is something very important to watch, and I don't know that I would yet say it's permanent. It's going to take some time.
Dave, just if I can, a lawyer moment on this, on the SOE issue. If you're interested in watching that space, you might look, I'm not telling you have to read the whole thing, but Chapter 17 of the TPP is an innovation. I mean, and just to step back and remind you of the political context. So the thought was that for the United States, in promoting the TPP negotiation when we were in favor of it, was in part to create a very high standard for disciplines on state-owned enterprises. with the thought that if the TPP were to come in, and if the United States were part of it, and if China eventually joined, then we would have negotiated these sort of with a coalition of the willing or more willing, and that this would be imposed on China as sort of a price of admission. So that was the dynamic then. As you know, things changed radically, but it's interesting. So that's the context. And so if you looked at that and the annex, so every country, these are disciplines on state-owned enterprises, and Mexico has a annex. These are a new set of annexes in these free trade agreements. So Annex 4, and you can look at the exceptions that Mexico took in order to get out from under these disciplines, for example, non-discriminatory treatment and commercial considerations that SOEs would otherwise have to follow. So you could actually track some of that issue, and I think then you'll follow it along, because clearly in the energy sector, SOEs are very important.
That's an annex of non-conforming measures. Right. That's you have a general obligation. The annex says what you're not going to do.
So, question up front here. He'll bring the microphone up to you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Bastis. I'm an independent consultant, and I have a question for the panel about market formation and the possibility of including some interesting and strong commitments within the agreement. As you know, Mexico is just starting to liberalize their market. So Pemex still a very big player in the market. There are some questions about how some companies have played in the bidding process, lowballing issues, making or basically paving the path for having a monopoly or an oligopoly in the short run. So would it be possible to include some measures that prevent or that actually foster having a competitive energy market within Mexico that in turn will help connect the three markets together?
I don't know.
Certainly, there are general requirements in transparency, and if you're worried about sort of corruption in a bidding process or something like that, I don't know that typical transparency obligations would reach that far. It's an interesting question. I'd have to think about it. I don't know. I can't.
No, it's certainly. I mean, the straight answer to your question is certainly possible, and Scott's right that that's where you would normally see those kind of issues addressed. You could. So it's certainly possible. I'd have to think about whether there are sort of antecedents in other agreements.
Question in the back.
Hi, I'm Kevin Doyle. I'm the intern for the Scholl Chair, and I've already had the pleasure of working with both Scott and Andy. My question is about the investor-state dispute settlement. I thought it was really interesting when Scott said that it'd be kind of ironic that just as soon as the Mexican energy sector potentially opens up to investment, that we might see this thing be scuttled, because obviously ISDS has been one of the most controversial parts of NAFTA and future trade agreements. So I'm just curious, even if it's for right or wrong, people don't like it, do you think there's any possibility of updating or changing the ISDS components of the investment chapter? There's been talks coming out of Europe of creating more of a multilateral dispute settlement process that would be more, transparent, and what kind of things we might be able to see coming into that area that could give political cover for keeping that part of the NAFTA.
That's a good question. Now, I would point out that since the NAFTA, Chapter 11, was written, it was the minimum standard of treatment was actually changed once. There was a decision in 2001 based on some of the early disputes that arose under NAFTA Chapter 11. And the parties clarified in writing. It was what's called the NAFTA Free Trade Commission, which is essentially the trade ministers of Canada and Mexico and the U.S. Trade Representative. So in 2001, based on the consideration of the experience with disputes in NAFTA Chapter 11, the three parties agreed to restate what's called the minimum standard of treatment. And in a international treaty, a binational treaty, that operates on international law, minimum standard of treatment is the key element of determining whether there is a treaty breach for things like expropriation or whatever the violation that's alleged might be. So the first change to NAFTA, which went into force in '94, was a change to the minimum standard of treatment, raising the threshold level in 2001. Subsequently, Congress got involved in the Trade Act of 2001 and instructed the administration, at that time the Bush administration, to do a better job of conforming our bilateral investment treaties and investment chapters to U.S. law and practice. In simple terms, the theory was that if a claimant were to win in an Article III U.S. court, they ought to win in investment arbitration if that same set of facts would be a losing case in an Article III case, then it ought to be a loss in investment arbitration. That's where the language that is in the NAFTA renegotiation actually comes from. It came from the statute, the Trade Act of 2001, and basically the same language reconfirmed in the Trade Act of 2015, the language being that it would protect U.S. investors abroad and provide no greater substantive rights to foreign investors in the United States. So there is, as a result of that instruction from the Congress in those two trade acts, actually just the first one, there was a model bit reissued by our Department of State in 2004. So we had 2004 model bit revised by the Obama administration into the 2012 model bit, both of which changed our negotiating parameters. And so here again, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what you had is an investment agreement that protected U.S. investors, that delivered against Congress's demands that foreign investors have no greater substantive rights than American investors similarly situated, that did pass muster. So yes, NAFTA Chapter 11, if it were to adopt the text adopted in TPP or something like it, would meet the negotiated objective, meet the objectives of Congress, and would likely continue to operate in a way that, basically what you have, the current situation in the NAFTA is there are a fair number of users of dispute settlement for Canada and Mexico. There are very few U.S. cases. There have only been 13. A claimant has never prevailed in a U.S. Chapter 11 case. So it's one of those things. And I think there's a revealed preference for our Article III courts in the U.S. Many foreign investors utilize U.S. courts. Just look at the record of the U.S. Court of Claims, thousands of cases. Okay, so in any case, that's the substantive obligations that they will try to achieve. And so the short answer is NAFTA Chapter 11 can be approved to make it more in line with what Congress required through the amendment. Second is the dispute settlement process. Investor-state dispute settlement, for all its conceived horrors, is actually very well suited for the task it's given, because violations of most sections of a trade agreement are about lines of commerce. They affect anybody who's transacting in those lines of commerce. Investment disputes arise from an incident at a single enterprise. Okay, and so having the single enterprise have the standing to depoliticize and manage the process in a model that was really conceived in commercial arbitration still is a sensible way to do it, and frankly, far superior to the alternative, which is espousal. Ask any of your State Department friends about the fun and games we've had over the years with espousal, where the government adopts and manages the claim for the private entity. So it actually can be worse. So that's the way I'd answer it. Whether it survives politically is yet another question, because frankly the narrative about investment arbitration is horrible, and it's seldom countered. So all bets are off there. But substantively, I do think there are improvements to the substantive obligations that can be made that are more in line with what the Congress expects and probably will be made. And how it survives, who knows?
Well, we're about out of time, but before leaving, Andy, I have to say that you gave me something more to be concerned about when you were looking at the language of the objectives of the reopening and the energy sector, and then looking at the energy security and North American energy independence language. And actually looking at it as if that might be a substantive and real objective, because those are terms that policymakers have been using for a long time, and they're a political statement. They're not a statement that believes that you actually can achieve and drive towards that. And my first thought was, well, that'll never become the objective, but I guess in this environment one can never say something it has to be ruled out. So it's probably a good thing for Sarah and others to be watching pretty closely in terms of how do you interpret that language in a way that actually works in the real world. So with that, join me in thanking Andy and Scott for participating in this.